Hey friends, welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Duane. I'm one of the pastors at Cathedral of the Rockies, Boise, First United Methodist Church. And if you don't have a church home, we would be honored to be your church home. Or if you're searching for a pastor, I'd be honored to serve as your pastor. We came up with the idea of Mental Health Monday during the pandemic when life kind of fell apart and we were all stuck at home. We said, how can we keep going? And so we created this moment. And then it's taken a little break and we're back now, and I've invited my friend Carol Betts to come and share with us. Carol's a member of the church, an active part, been at both campuses, at the Amity campus in downtown. Some of you may have even taken Carol's class. She's taught a class on grief. And one of the reasons I brought her in this time was to say, you know, this time of year, Carol, it's dark, it's cold. A lot of times we hunker down and it's real easy, it seems to me, for grief to reappear. So I thought we'd bring Carol in. She's kind of an expert. Would you tell a little bit of your story, Carol? How did this become a passion of yours to help others through their grief?
Well, I had been through a number of grief experiences myself, especially a divorce after being married for 33 years.
Wow.
And nothing really prepares you for that. And I noticed that not everybody wanted to listen to me talk about my grief, and it was challenging. And I found a therapist, and I worked through as best I could. And then, a number of years later, I was at a church staff, and we sat as staff people and said, we are not ministering to our people well enough in the area of grief. And boy, I knew that myself. And so we did some looking around to find what we thought would be a good program. And we chose the grief recovery method because we liked something that had some organization to it and some steps you could follow to help you process the grief that you were going through. So I went and got myself trained to do that, and I appreciated the program so much when I was using it with folks that I went back and took the advanced training. I like to get trained, and so that's what I'm so enjoying, and that's what I've been doing out here since we've taken 30 people here at the Cathedral through the grief recovery program. We'd like to make it available to many more.
Yeah. So watch for that if you're wondering when this comes up, and we'll put Carol's contact information up too in a few minutes. But you can contact Carol directly, or you can always email me at pastor@boisefumc.org, and I'll make sure that if you've got a question for Carol, or you want to get in touch when the next class is or the next gathering, or if you'd like to just do some personal connection and counseling, Carol does that also, right?
Yes.
Carol, I like that you talked about, my assumption was you were going to tell me your husband died, and yet you're telling me, no, your grief was about divorce after 30 some years of marriage. And it's a great reminder, grief isn't just death.
Absolutely.
What else is it?
We talk about over 40 different kinds of life experiences that cause us to grieve. Partially the death, which is what we normally assume, a divorce, the loss of a career, the loss of a job that you thought would take you through your entire life. Retirement, people think that is a wonderful thing, which it is, but it's also a time of loss. Losses and grief come when you go to the doctor and you get an unexpected diagnosis, and all of a sudden you're in a very different place in life and you've lost your good health. So there are many, many things that can cause us to grieve. And children grieve, which is something that we didn't used to think about too much. And one of the books that the Grief Recovery Institute does is this When Children Grieve. And I'm hoping to do a group for parents and teachers pretty soon.
Great.
Where they can learn how to help their children in the grief process. There's a big cost in our culture to grief, and we all think, well, we can just push it down and get through, but there's a lot more to it.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. As you're talking, I'm hearing kind of the echo of Jesus' teaching in the Beatitudes, blessed are they who mourn, which, most of us would say, really? But as we study that passage, we recognize the word we use, blessedness, often can be maybe better translated, God is present with you, God is with you, God is on your side when you mourn. So God, or you might even say God is holding you when you mourn.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah. So how did you know, I mean, as you were in your own journey, your divorce, how did you recognize it as grief? What were were there signs in your body and your spirit and your mind? What was it you went, oh, I'm grieving? How did you know that?
I didn't really know it very well back then because I didn't have many signs. But what I did see was I was in kind of a fog.
Okay.
And now we talk about a grief fog. So you drag yourself out of bed and you get to work, but you're not real productive because you're just in a fog. You end up saying and doing things that sometimes hurt other people that you wouldn't normally do. But you're just not yourself when you're in a grief experience. There can be, often we get caught in what we call, in grief recovery, we call STIRBs, that is short-term energy relieving behaviors. When you're grieving, there is so much energy being used inside you, even seated in a chair. My insides are just rumbling and roaring. My mind is going 100 miles an hour. And it takes a lot of energy out of you. And it's important that you begin to watch how you're trying to deal with that energy. So sometimes we get in, we find things that give us a short-term relief, like that 10th cookie. Oh, that really gave me some relief. You know, that my short-term energy reliever when I'm grieving is I watch movies. Just live somebody else's life for a while.
Right.
Now, there's nothing wrong with movies. That's right. There's nothing wrong with cookies. There's nothing wrong with a glass of wine before you go to bed until it turns into 2 and 3 and on. Looking for ways to help us deal with grief. Grief presents in us almost a beach ball full of emotion, and we're trying to keep it down. But of course, what does a beach ball do? It pushes forcefully up. And so we're looking for ways that we can keep it down, like the ways I've suggested, plus others. But that takes a lot of energy. We can defuse that beach ball and deal with those emotions and then come back to who we really are.
I think a lot of us, include a lot of pastors, that when I work with pastors, are in the midst of grief from the pandemic.
Yes.
The grief of the church being closed for months, the grief of not doing the things that bring life, the grief of folks who disappeared from the church when the church reopened, the grief of trying to figure out how to do church post-pandemic. There's a lot of grief going on in my community with clergy. One of the things for me I think about is, and I often say when I'm helping a family plan a funeral, find your way to grieve.
Yes. And
I say some of us are readers, so we have to read about the loss of a child or the loss of a father. Some of us are talkers. That's me. We have to sit and talk with our friends about the one we've lost and talk it out and tell the stories. And some of us are more, we got to get outside, we got to move, we've got to do something. What are some of the things you would say to somebody if you recognize you're grieving a loss, whether it's a job, a spouse, the pandemic, you know, what would be some of the actions you would say, here's some simple things you could do to begin to pay attention to your grief, but also to release some of it?
And I really recognize and affirm what you're saying about the uniqueness of every person's grief experience. Just because Harry does something doesn't mean it would help me at all.
Right.
So for each person to take a little survey of themselves, to think about what have they done in the past that has given them relief when they had stresses and pressures, then that might be something that would help. Are they extroverted or introverted? Okay. I'm an extrovert and I want to talk to somebody. And it's not always easy to find somebody to talk to because it makes some people uncomfortable to talk about that.
Right.
But those are really good examples that you gave about being an extrovert or introvert. Reading, podcasts are so big these days, and you can find a lot of them on grief. So look around and try a few things. Don't just assume that something won't work, but try a few things until you find them. And then many times, finding a therapist or going to a group experience like the one we do with grief recovery provide what we just can't find anywhere else. the intellectual, but also the feeling part of healing from grief.
You're making me think one of the things I'm remembering from my mother when my dad passed away, and simple things like, who do I sit with in church?
Yes.
Right, was a big deal. And after a while, she finally said, I'm actually going to move from where I normally sat with your dad, and I'm going to sit with one of my friends, because her husband had died. And so all of a sudden there was this little cluster, right, of ladies that sat together and looked for each other when one wasn't there. One would say, well, Carol's not here today. Somebody check on Carol. And so kind of creating a new habit, right? But that also allowed her to continue the old, attending church.
Yes.
But there was this, she had to walk through that weirdness of, well, we always sat here, and now I sit here by myself.
Yes. One of the definitions of grief that we talk about is the natural and normal response to loss of any kind. It doesn't feel natural and normal.
No.
But it really is. And another definition we use with grief is when you have a change or a disruption in normal everyday habits, like you've lost your husband to some disease, and you're used to him going off to work every day. And every morning he says goodbye and kisses you on the cheek. And suddenly
that's gone.
That is gone. So looking not only at the things that can help you, but exploring what happens to you every day. And which of those things that happen to you every day when this person alive, or when you were married, or however it might be. And explore what that helps you be aware of when you need to do something and change something. Your mother was so wise to do that.
Well, that's where it comes from.
It must be.
She would claim that. You brought a couple other resources. Is there a book
did.
you wanted to make sure we talked about?
Well, I wanted to let you know that Grief Recovery also does a pet loss class, because we now know
Yes,
you
definitely.
you don't
Right.
just lose a pet, you can get another one. It's very difficult.
Right.
This is the book that we use in the Grief Recovery class. You can buy it
Online.
anywhere.
Grief
Amazon.
Recovery Handbook.
You can probably get it at a library as well.
Yeah.
But it really helps to realize, and what we talk about in our book, is that people around you don't always give you good advice about how to handle grief. And especially with the pet loss, the author of our book talks about when he was a child and his longtime pet, his dog, that he told every secret to and slept with him at night.
Right.
And the dog died. And he was crying and crying, and his parents didn't know what to do. They felt totally unable to help with his crying. So one day, just a couple of days later, his dad marches up and opens the door to his room and says, okay, stop this crying. Saturday, we're going to go get you another dog. Well, that's a replacement. And no matter how many dogs they buy him, he needs to grieve the loss of the dog that he loved.
Yeah.
So our culture kind of tells us some things that don't help us a lot. One of the big things that I hate to hear sometimes is when people say to you, and I hear this a lot, you need to be strong now. Be strong, Duane, for your wife. You know, you're both experiencing this grief, but you need to be strong. So then, this happened to John, who wrote our book. People were telling him when they lost their child, you need to be strong for your wife. And other people said to the wife, you need to be strong for John.
Right.
So they were both trying to be strong for each other, which means neither of them was dealing with all of their pain. And then it caused a rift in their marriage, and they didn't stay together. And that happens often because relationships can pay the ultimate price when we do not deal with the pain that is caused by grief.
I have a friend who says the greater the loss, the less words we should say.
And let the other person say what they need to say.
Let them, it's just the greater the loss, the more tragic the loss, he says, you be present.
Yes.
And there just aren't words at times. We try to fill the space, and sometimes that's our own need to make us feel better.
It is our own
I don't know how to make you feel better, but I'll make myself feel better, so I'm going to say, and we know that list of things people say that we shouldn't say, well, the Lord needed them.
Yes.
That's terrible theology.
Yes, it is.
So that's not worth saying. or that it'll get easier tomorrow.
That is right.
We don't want it to get easier. I loved this person.
Yes.
I loved my job, or whatever the loss was. I'll get to another place. I always think is okay. I'll get to another place with my grief, but I won't. You'll get over it. We don't want to say you'll get over it. Is there anything else that comes to mind that we should take off of our list when we're helping a friend grieve that we shouldn't say?
Well, even the things of God is giving you the best, gave him the best, gave her the best. Sometimes people who grieve are angry with God.
Yeah, definitely.
And we've got to be willing to let them be angry. And sometimes we get so scared that somebody we love is being angry with God. But it is so important that people be able to feel what they feel and say what they feel. When I have a class, I'll often ask them after they have had, I put them into groups of 3 and they'll share some of their experiences. And the rule is you don't interrupt the person who's talking. And I ask them, how long has it been since somebody let you talk about your grief and didn't interrupt you?
Oh, wow.
And for many of them, they hadn't found that before they came to the class. People interrupt us. They don't mean to be mean, but they're nervous. They're not sure they want to hear, and we'll just sort of get clogged up then.
One last thing, Carol, as we think, and then I'll give you a minute if you want to talk about some of the counseling and classes you teach. But what if my grief was 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Maybe I was busy, or maybe I did have to be, or I felt like I had to be strong at that moment, and I pushed through, and the family got through it, but I never gave space to that. Is it too late for me to grieve something that happened 5 years ago?
Absolutely not. I have people in the class that grieve over something 20 years ago.
Okay.
Their mother died, or their dad, or they had a horrible work experience and lost not only the job, but all the people there.
Okay.
And we can go back to whenever it was that something happened, and you've been stuffing it just because that's what we do, and you just haven't had a chance to express it and really figure out what it was. Who was the person that you were most angry with at that job? And we've got to resolve that.
And then come back to it. Come back to it, figure out where the ground is.
Absolutely.
And resolve it.
Absolutely.
So share a little bit about this is your life, your ministry,
Yes.
your work. How could somebody get in touch with you? And are you teaching classes? What are you doing?
My email is C for Carol, and my last name, BETTS001 @gmail, and they're going to put that on the screen for you. And I teach in person sometimes, or sometimes over Zoom.
Okay.
A group, and a group for grief recovery is in person is no more than 15. So we're not talking about a huge class
big
where
class.
you will never get. This is a very personal thing, and the online classes we cut at 8. And one of the things about the classes is they are very confidential. What is said in that class stays in that class, and even to the point that I don't tell people who's in the class. And they don't tell people who the others are in that class. So it's very confidential, and you have a chance to say what you've been needing to say, but we were afraid that somebody would fall over dead if you said it. And this is your chance to do it. It's also your chance to hear some truths about grief that you just didn't hear from well-meaning people that were around you. Then the pet loss is another one. But I'm especially interested this year in trying to do some classes around helping children with loss. It's almost the preventative step. You know, once we get to be adults and we've learned all of these things, then we have to sort of relearn. But if we could teach our children when they're young. In fact, research shows that if a child is like 5 or maybe younger, they tend to automatically intuitively know how to handle grief. But as soon as they get a little bit older, they start learning what they've been told. You know, be strong, just stay busy. Time heals all wounds, all of those crazy things. And so if I could teach some of those classes to parents, grandparents, teachers, that's what I'm going to be doing too.
Great.
And you can find out about that by emailing me.
All right, perfect. Well, Carol, thanks for this time. If you want to contact Carol, you can get her email. It should be on the screen, or you can always email me at pastor@boisefumc.org, and we'll send it to Carol and get her connected to you. And then we just want to remind you of these 4 things. You are loved by, and you matter to God. No crisis will last forever. There is always hope, and others can help you. Just ask. Grace and peace, friends.